I want to talk about movie stereotypes. And the thing to remember about stereotypes is that just like our culture, movies are full of them, and they always have been. And what is a stereotype? It's a generalization or a belief about a person based on everything. We stereotype based on height, based on weight, based on gender, based on ethnicity, based on if you wear glasses, your hair color. In fact, a couple of the most famous stereotypes we have, like the dumb blonde stereotype, that comes from movies. Marilyn Monroe, she played a dumb blonde in most of her movies. In real life, she was very bright, but she was emotionally fragile, so she always played this dumb blonde character, and that stuck. And before her, we had some other actresses play dumb blondes. Another famous movie stereotype is the Latin lover stereotype. In fact, there's a movie from the 1940s where Rita Hayworth is dancing and a man cuts in and she says, "Oh, you know what they say about those Latin men." Then after that, we got a series of movies with the Latin lover stereotype, usually played by Ricardo Montalban. And movies are full of stereotypes today. If you remember Toy Story 3, Buzz Lightyear becomes a Latin lover and immediately puts a rose in his teeth. So there's no avoiding these stereotypes. But this is the problem with stereotypes in movies and in media in general, is we export these movies all over the world. And if you think about it, with the exception of a few positive stereotypes, like the Latin lover one, for example, most stereotypes are negative. And they're often demeaning and they're often racist. And so when you export these movies all over the world, and people all over the world keep seeing the same type of person in a very negative, demeaning role, they believe that. So they reinforce negative beliefs about people, and that's what movies have done. For example, in the 1970s, they made a lot of movies about Latino gang members, and that was supposed to be a message about how bad it was to be a gang member. In fact, gang membership increased after these movies, but the whole world sees these movies, and so that's a big problem that we have with movie stereotypes. Why do we have stereotypes? Well, there's several reasons. One reason is it's shorthand for character development. And so what I mean by that is, let's say you have a character in a movie and he's on the screen for 2 minutes and he's a hotel clerk, but he's a gay hotel clerk. So 2 minutes does not give you a lot of time to develop this character. You don't have time for any backstory about this character. But if you make this character gay, then all of a sudden the audience thinks, "Oh, I know everything about him because he's gay." So it's actually a device that screenwriters use to put a lot of information in a character in a very short time. Now, that may or may not be a good reason for having a stereotype, but that's often what screenwriters do in movies. The worst time for movie stereotypes in the last 100 years was before 1950. The first half century of movies between 1900, 1950, I would say the main reason that movies were full of stereotypes is because the studio bosses, the men who ran the studios, were racist. Most of them, maybe with the exception of Walt Disney, there's a lot of stories and writing that Disney was anti-Semitic, meaning he didn't like Jewish people, but there's not a lot of evidence that says he was a racist. The biggest evidence related to that was the movie Song of the South that Disney made in the 40s. And if you look today on Disney Plus, the new streaming service, you won't see Song of the South. That's like Disney's embarrassment. But you have to keep in mind, before 1950, these men, including Walt Disney, who ran the studios, they were a product of the culture they lived in. And we lived in a very racist, segregated culture. This was an era when we had lynchings going on in many states. Interracial marriage was illegal up until the 1960s. So the movies reflected the bias and the racism of the men who ran the studios. And I could give you story after story with evidence about why Jack Warner was racist or why Louis B. Mayer was racist. but I think the best proof is the movies they made. And so if you were in a movie before 1950 and you belonged to an ethnic group, you were going to play a stereotype. You were going to be a slave or a dancer or a maid or a cook. You were not going to be a college president. You were not going to be a lawyer. You were not going to be a banker. You were stuck in these very stereotypical roles. And I've written a list of names here on the board. These were some of the pioneers that we had when it comes to stereotypes. And these are also some of the names that you're going to hear in the video that I posted on Canvas that I want you to watch. So if we go back to the very early days, back to the silent era, you see a trend in movies, which is probably one of the most racist, offensive trends in movie history, called acting in blackface. And we saw a lot of this in the silent era. We saw some of it after the silent era. You don't see much of it anymore. Basically, what acting in blackface refers to is this practice where white actors would put on black makeup and pretend to be African American. And it's real obvious they're not. And so it always struck me as real bizarre when you'd be seeing a silent movie and you could clearly see that the person is not African American, but they're made to look up that way. And a lot of famous movies, like the 3-hour silent movie Birth of a Nation in 1915, had actors in blackface. But what's even more unusual is they would cast real African Americans to play a lot of roles, but then for the leading roles, they would cast a white actor and put him in black makeup. So it did a combination of both. So there's two movies up here that are two of the most famous movies in history, and they have a couple things in common in terms of stereotyping, and it's featuring actors in blackface. The first one is the classic Birth of a Nation, 1915, by director D.W. Griffith. He's a famous director because he's a pioneer in using camera shots, like the first to use a close-up. And then in 1915, he directed a 3-hour movie, Birth of a Nation, considered one of the most racist movies ever made. It's based on the novel The Klansman, which portrays the KKK, the Klan, as the heroic savior of the South. It's also the first movie to ever be shown at the White House. And so it's a very famous movie in movie history, and it's also very racist and very negative toward African Americans. An equally famous movie is the 1927 movie, The Jazz Singer, and this featured an actor named Al Jolson, and he was a singer, performer on vaudeville on the stage, and his whole acting performance was he would put on blackface, and he would put on a wig, and then he would come out and sing. So when they made this movie, The Jazz Singer, what's famous about this movie in movie history is that it's the first talking movie. This is the first movie where you hear dialogue from the actors, and it came out in 1927. In terms of stereotypes, it features acting in blackface. So these are two of the most famous movies in history, and they're also quite racist, and they have that feature acting in blackface. Some other pioneers in movie history is an actor named Stepin Fetchit, and he made movies in the 1930s and the 1940s. Stepin Fetchit, which is a nickname, of course, he's the first African-American movie star. Movie star in terms of he became rich, he became famous, he had 6 mansions, he had servants, thousands of people showed up when he gave personal appearances, but his entire career, all he ever played was a stereotype. And these were very demeaning stereotypes where he was bumbling and couldn't speak very well, and that was all an act. And he was so good at playing stereotypes, he became rich and famous. In fact, I read an interesting story once about Stepin Fetchit. He would have 2 phones in his house. And one phone he would answer the way he normally did, hello. And the other phone was for the Stepin Fetchit character. So he would pick up that phone and then he would talk like somebody wanted to hear Stepin Fetchit. So depending on which phone in his house rang, he spoke either like himself or like the character Stepin Fetchit. So Stepin Fetchit's a very demeaning character in African American history. Another pioneer in terms of stereotypes is the actress Hattie McDaniel. Hattie McDaniel played a very negative stereotype in the early decades of the movies, the 30s and 40s, and she was the mammy. So if you were African American, if you were an African American woman who was heavy set, you often played a mammy, which was basically a servant or a maid. And in 1939, in the classic movie Gone with the Wind, Hattie McDaniel played the character Mammy. And she played this character so well that she became the first African American to win an Academy Award in 1939. And to give you an idea what the times were like, she won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for the movie Gone with the Wind, yet she wasn't invited to the premiere of the movie in Atlanta. None of the African American actors were invited. So that kind of gave you an idea of the climate of the times. Another interesting story about Hattie McDaniel, the story that I always loved, is she was criticized by the African American community for playing a maid. And she was in about 200 movies, but all she ever played was a maid. And her response was, I'd rather be a maid in the movies than be a maid, which I always loved, because what role was she being offered that she was turning down? I mean, this was all she was allowed to do. Had she come along in the 70s or 80s, she would have had a great career. She was a good actress, but she was a prisoner of the stereotypes of the times. A couple other trailblazers in terms of stereotypes, Bill Bojangles Robinson. So Bill Robinson was a trailblazer in movies in the 1930s and 1940s. He was a great dancer, but he was stuck and frustrated by the servant roles that he had to play in movies because he was African American. His big breakthrough came when he got a dance partner named Shirley Temple. Shirley Temple, in the 1930s, as an 8-year-old kid, she was the #1 movie star in the nation. She was a cute, precocious little girl full of blonde curls, and in 3 movies, Shirley Temple and Bill Robinson danced together. They held hands together. He was an old man, she was a little girl. It was cute, it was adorable, and the audience loved it. And so that was a step forward in terms of stereotyping and what audiences would allow and what audiences would not allow. Something else I wanted to point out about dancers and African American singers in movies, they often would play a scene in a movie where they would sing or dance. These were called specialty numbers, and they were not integral to the plot of the movie, and they filmed them that way so that when these movies played in the South, they could be taken out of the movie so that racist theater goers would not be upset. So specialty numbers were little dance scenes or musical interlude scenes with African Americans that could be easily edited out of the movie, and the movie would still make sense. They weren't a big part of the plot. The most important name on the board up here, the name I want you to remember above all, is Sidney Poitier. In my opinion, the 3 most important people in movies from the 20th century are Charlie Chaplin, Sidney Poitier, and Walt Disney, because each in their own way moved movies forward. And for Sidney Poitier, he broke down barriers. His entire career, he broke down barriers. He started his career in 1950, and in his very first movie, he played a doctor. He was the first African American to play a doctor. And his entire career, he refused to play a stereotype. That's how he broke down barriers. He got a lot of scripts that he found were demeaning, and he just turned them down. He wouldn't play it because he didn't think the character was respectful. And so he was the opposite of Stepin Fetchit. Stepin Fetchit was famous in the 1930s. All he ever portrayed was a stereotype. Sidney Poitier started his career in the 1950 in a very controversial movie called No Way Out, which has a race riot at the end of the movie, and he's the first African American to play a doctor. So throughout his career, Sidney Poitier had a number of firsts. After No Way Out, he was the first African American male to win an Academy Award. Hattie McDaniel was the first African American to win an Academy Award for Gone with the Wind. Sidney Poitier became the first African American actor to win an Academy Award. He had the first interracial kiss in a movie in the classic romantic comedy in 1967, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? And you only see the kiss once in the rearview mirror. They're sitting in a taxi cab and you see them kissing in the cab's rearview mirror. But that was a big breakthrough. That was an interracial kiss. And coincidentally, the movie came out in 1967. Within months of the movie coming out, the Supreme Court threw out interracial marriage, making it legal. Because when that movie was made, it was against the law. The law wasn't changed because of the movie, but the timing of the movie and the coincidence was always interesting, with Guess Who's Coming to Dinner being about interracial marriage, and then the Supreme Court changing the law. So these are some of the pioneers when it comes to movie stereotyping and movie censorship. We're focusing on these actors and actresses, but what I want you to remember is that every single ethnic group has their actors and actresses who have been stereotyped throughout history. And if you go back in movie history, the farther you go back, the more stereotypes you see. And so during the 1970s, Latinos became so frustrated with these stereotypes that they started making movies about themselves. They were tired of waiting for the studios to make movies about the Latino experience. So in the 70s and 80s, they started making movies about their own experience. So you saw movies like Mi Familia and La Bamba, and they wanted to tell their own stories. So in these small independent films, like the Jaime Escalante movie, Stand and Deliver, about the math teacher, played by Edward James Olmos, you saw all these wonderful stories about Latinos that were basically ignored by the studios. African Americans also did this in the 90s when they started making movies like Boys in the Hood. They were basically being ignored by the studios, so directors like John Singleton, who came out of USC, wanted to tell more realistic stories, and we got all these independent movies. Another important note about movie stereotypes, if you look at the history of the Academy Awards, the Academy Awards has been very controversial. In fact, a couple years ago, there was a social media campaign with the hashtag #OscarsSoWhite because not one of the main nominees was African American. In fact, if you look at the Academy Award nominees in 2019, there was only one. Only one of the main nominees was African American, and that was for Best Actress. And to this day, there has not been an African American director to win an Academy Award. Not one, not one. And you go back through the history of the Academy Awards, Sidney Poitier won his Academy Award in the early 1960s for Lilies of the Field. An African American actor did not win again until Denzel Washington for Training Day. So that's a big, huge gap. So there's only a few small number of Academy Awards. And that's often looked upon as a problem with the movie industry. So to sum up, the movie industry has always been full of stereotypes. They used to be a lot worse than they are now. Before 1950, they were much, much worse. Everything changed after World War II. The entire culture changed, and so did movies. One thing that happened is the Mammy character disappeared. You didn't see mammies in movies after 1950. And ironically, some of this happened because of World War II. Because if you look back in history, during World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, allowed African Americans to fight in the army in segregated units during World War II. And so after this happened, FDR and representatives from the NAACP, which stands for National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, they went to talk to the movie studios, and they basically gave the studios a pep talk. And they said, you know, you've got all these demeaning, negative characters in movies like the Mammy. Let's do better. Let's have some more positive images. So actually, the studios listened, and after World War II ended, soon after, two things immediately happened. The Mammy disappeared, and then 1950, Sidney Poitier played a doctor, you know. So movies still had stereotypes, but we started to see progress. One of the most offensive movie stereotypes that I've ever seen, and this was even going on, well, it was going on in the 1950s, and in one way it's still going on today, and this is where you would cast a white actor to play an Asian. You know, you look back in the 1950s and you see Mickey Rooney playing a very negative Asian stereotype, you know, not even close to being an Asian character. And then a few years ago, the actress Scarlett Johansson was cast as playing an Asian. And so studios do this because they think that there's going to be more box office if they cast a famous actress, despite the fact that her ethnicity doesn't match the character she's supposed to play. The good news is that every time you have a movie like Crazy Rich Asians with a very ethnic cast, if that movie breaks through big and makes a lot of money, then you start to see more movies with ethnicity. Another example of that is the big hit movie, Black Panther. The movie Black Panther was a breakthrough in many ways. It was a huge financial success with a primarily African-American cast. But the best thing the movie did behind the scenes is it opened the door for other movies about African-Americans. I read a great example of that screenwriter who wrote the movie about Harriet Tubman, which came out last year, which came out in 2019. He had written a script decades before that, and he circulated the script to studios trying to get the movie made. And he has this funny story about him having a meeting with studio bosses who were reading his Harriet Tubman script, and they said, yeah, we really like this movie. We'd like to do a movie by Harriet Tubman. We could cast Julia Roberts. And he said, no, Julia Roberts is not black. We can't, no, it'll work. So this is how studios would think. And you notice that Harriet Tubman got made in 2019, and this screenwriter credits the success of Black Panther for allowing this movie to get made. The studios all of a sudden thought, okay, there's other stories to tell. So this is the way studios work, where one movie hits it big and it opens the door for other stories. Or when an actor like Sidney Poitier breaks down barriers, Denzel Washington, when he won his Academy Award for Training Day, he thanked Sidney Poitier for opening doors for him. So the movies have a long, sordid history in terms of stereotypes and negative racist portrayals. Things are better, they're not perfect, but this is where we are this year in 2020.